So first I'll start by telling you a little bit about myself. This talk is brought to you tonight by Claritin and Flonase, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to breathe. So I'm a web developer. I live up in Plymouth. I work for a small agency called Thought, and we do a lot of WordPress sites. And we also specialize in rebranding companies and logos and things like that, which I don't actually touch any of that. The designers do that. I actually am not really a trained web developer, so to speak. I did go to a boot camp, and prior to that, I first started programming in 3rd grade. And I don't remember what the language was, but it was on an Apple IIe. And I remember it was really cool because we got to go into the teacher's lounge and use the vending machines, like the soda machine, the snack machine. That was a big deal. After that, I started playing with programming robots in high school. And the robots were made out of Legos. That was Logo was the language. Then once I got to college, I started learning HTML, CSS, and then after that, actually Flash. And that was back when when people were using Flash, but not only that, Flash's error messages were about as helpful as a WordPress error message when you don't have WP debug turned on, because it just said, there's an error in your code, with nothing to fix it, no line number, nothing. And then I started doing HTML and CSS at a radio station because I was working in radio. And then after that, I taught for a while, got a master's in education, worked at a car dealership very briefly, and that experience led me to going to a boot camp because I realized I didn't want to work at a car dealership for my career. So I went to a boot camp down in South Carolina called the Iron Yard. It was awesome. It was a lot of fun. I learned Ruby on Rails, and I worked at a software as a service company down there. Then moved back up here, started doing some freelance work with Thought, and that was almost 4 years ago now. And so I've been doing WordPress and some other like proprietary CMS development for about 4 years now. And because I taught and worked at radio stations, that's why I'm comfortable getting up here and speaking to people. Anyway, enough about me. CSS Grid and Flexbox. How many of you have experience with Flexbox? Okay, a handful. What about CSS Grid? A few. Cool. How many of you write CSS on a regular basis? Okay, there's some more. Good. So CSS Grid is pretty universal right now. Flexbox is considered universal because any browser that's still supported by companies, you can use Flexbox, which includes the one thing CSS Grid doesn't support is Internet Explorer 11. And Microsoft is supporting Internet Explorer 11, I think, until sometime in 2020. So if your clients still use Internet Explorer, you should nudge them to Chrome, Edge, Firefox, Safari, anything that isn't Internet Explorer, because pretty soon they'll actually be using what would be considered an unsecure browser because it won't get security updates. And CSS Grid is supported by over 90% of like worldwide browser usage. Internet Explorer is less than 10%. I think it's like 4 or 5. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head. So what is Flexbox good for? So this is just some very simple HTML in CodePen. I just created an unordered list with a few items, and in the CSS I'm setting the height, a background color. And when someone says Flexbox, what they're talking about is the display flex property. And so I set display to flex, and then Flexbox also has, you can set a direction. Row puts whatever you're setting along the x-axis, and if you were to use column, that would set your items going vertically. So for this, I sort of envisioned it as if you were using like a navigation bar, because that's one of the places where I would absolutely recommend Flexbox over CSS Grid. So I'm using row, and then justify content is a really cool feature. What it does is it allows you to decide, like, I'm just going to delete that, and it actually doesn't do anything. But if I change it to start, you can see it shifted the items to the beginning of the where the list is, and I can also change that to end. That is odd.
Flex end? Flex end.
Oops. And this is why I don't live code very much, because I'm not good at typing. So flex end, which I'm surprised, a lot of the times it will work with just the keyword end and not flex end, even though that technically is the property. But that pushes everything to the end of your area. And you can also do space between, so that has it puts it so things, all of the space, extra space, it lives in between your items. And then if you want something that has, that looks closer to centered, that would be space around. And the best part about Flexbox, my favorite thing, is if you've ever worked with HTML and CSS and you've got something that you want to center inside of a box. Before Flexbox, you had to mess with positioning and add padding or like set heights and widths and do all of that. Flexbox has this awesome little property, align items. So right now it's set to center, and you can see everything's nice in the middle. If I do flex end, it pushes it down to the bottom. And flex start puts it up at the top. And before Flexbox, people would spend hours writing tutorials on how to center things in CSS. And then you'd spend hours reading tutorials because it never actually worked the way you expected it to your first try. But now with Flexbox, that problem has been solved, and it's awesome. So that's, I mean, you can do a lot more with Flexbox, but sort of the most, Flexbox at its most basic and core usefulness now that Grid is here is if you've got things like lists or things that all are going to live inside of a wrapping container and not be the not things that you want like broken apart, but that live like you can use Flexbox for layout, but you're going to run into situations if you do where it's not going to work that great. And if I expanding more on that, the CSS Grid course that I have linked to in this, and this is this URL is my website is richsalvucci.me/gridtalk, and I have a bunch of resources like the CSS tricks guides for Flexbox and Grid, which I use all the time. In fact, I used to, if I typed F into the browser, the CSS guide for Flexbox would come up. That would be the suggested website because I had to Google it every time. But these guides, I'll just open up the CSS Grid one. It says I don't have internet. How did that happen?
I've been here for a couple hours. The Wi-Fi drops off like every 20 minutes.
Oh, that is... Oh. And we have internet again. So these are the guides, and anything I'm going to talk about, if I... Like, it gives you all the properties, but they also have really great examples of how it works with diagrams. And there's also Grid by Example by Rachel Andrew. Experimental Layout Lab by Jen Simmons. She is actually one of the people who writes the spec for CSS Grid at Mozilla. And she has some really interesting stuff on her site. She's very smart, very interesting to read, and she does do a lot of layouts. In fact, just because I'm talking about how there are layouts, like this is how her site is laid out with the links, which is pretty crazy.
Show off.
Yeah, exactly. It is a little difficult to read, but it's very cool how she did that. Flexbox Froggy is a learning tool. It will teach you Flexbox in a fun little game. And the same thing with CSS Grid Garden. And both of those were created by a company called CodePip. If you click on these links from this site, it will take you right to the tutorial. If you did a Google search for it, you're going to have to log in, give them your email. It is free. Wes Boss's course is also free, and I highly recommend that. But if you didn't want to give them your email, these links from my page it just goes to the course. So, on to CSS Grid. So I have a little, why is that? Oh. That's what I want to do. So I'm just going to open it up in a new tab, just so you can see the browser window and not the code. And actually, that's interesting. So I'll talk about that in a minute. What CSS Grid allows you to do, if we go back and look at the code, is, and this is just going to move that down. So this class of container1, this is, when we go back to the other page, you can see it's just a div with a class, and then some classes of item. I individualize each item just so I can, with CSS Grid, change how they display. So that code we're looking at is actually this top one here, and I used a base of 12 columns because how many of you have used Bootstrap before on a website? Since Bootstrap does 12 columns, I figured I would do a 12 column example because it's familiar to a lot of people who use it. So with the grid styles, this top is just, I decided to add some base styles. So when you look at an item, you see what's going on. So I added a background color, width, font size, and then align self and text. Align self is a grid property, and it is a property on the child element. Because if we go back here and look at the examples, the way this is set up is you've got properties for the parent or the container or the children, which are the items. So that so that is where you get the align self center, and what that is doing, if we go back here, is it's putting the 1, the 2, the 3 in the middle of the item. And then, so the container is where all of the grid magic happens. The first thing we're doing, just like with Flexbox, is you set display to be grid, and then you've got your grid template columns. The way grid template columns work is you set the number of columns, and then you can set columns either by width. It will accept pixels, percentages, or this called FR. And what FR is, I believe it stands for fractional unit, and it is like when you set grid template columns, repeat 12, you're setting 12 columns to be 1 fractional unit. So that's actually giving you the fractional columns. And when I inspect the page, so you can see with all of these boxes that are there, that are the dotted lines, those are the 12 columns going across and being repeated. So the thing you can do is you can actually, on your individual items, there's a grid column property, and that allows you to set your columns to span. So for example, column 1, I don't know why that view is happening. But column 1 is 8, column 2 is 4, column 3 is of course 9, then we have 3 of 1, column 7 goes 12 across, and then and you're wondering, so what happens with all these when I make it responsive? So the cool thing about grid is when you're using things like fractional units, it's responsive by design. And this layout works with the 12 columns only because the content is a single number, and the grid rows would expand to like if rather than 8 this had a bunch of text, it would make that row taller, but it would not make it wider, because we're setting the grid columns to be one fractional unit. So with grid, it's natively responsive, but you do have to keep in mind that you're not necessarily doing yourself any favors, so to speak, by leaving it set as just the way it is if you're doing a bunch of small columns. And if that is actually, so all of the containers I did, and this is container 2, they're all this, it's all the same. Both of these containers have the same HTML, but different CSS. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to just interrupt me and ask as I go through these things. So what I did with container 2, the difference is on the grid template columns, I did a repeat of autofit and a min max of 200, but still 1 FR. So what min max does is it sets the minimum of the minimum and the maximum width that we can allow is 200 pixels would be the minimum, and 1 FR is the maximum. I think I have that right. But what it does, oh, I forgot to mention grid gap. Grid gap is what you use, and this is actually really important. If I take this off, all of the space you see in between these, this white space, is set with grid gap, not margin. When you're using CSS Grid and you set a margin, it's additive. So what that means is if your grid is 1,000 pixels wide and you want each item to have a margin of 10 pixels on either side, and it's a 10 pixel grid, because that means your actual content width, rather than being the 1,000 pixels you were expecting, because margin adds to it, you're looking at 1,200 pixels. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's what the grid gap property takes care of. You don't have to worry about things being additive. It just works within the constraints you're putting it in. And setting it up, toggle back. So doing the auto fit and the min max actually allows us, when we go to mobile, you can see these are now stacking properly in their row rather than getting squished together like they are in the upper grid. And both of those are absolutely good ways to do a layout with CSS Grid. But I think where grid, personally at least, where grid really shines is in something called grid template areas. What a grid template area is, and you can see in my code, I have header, 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 main content, sidebar, footer, footer, and footer. And this looks a little weird because it doesn't look like CSS. You're adding strings to set up the areas. But when we look at the code, not the code, when we look at the HTML that is rendered, and this display is much more narrow than the native display on my computer, because this is actually a good lesson in why you test in different screen sizes and browsers, because I set the main content to have a width or a height of 500 pixels, in the sidebar to have a height. And it's not actually breaking it up the way it would if it was unplugged, because as you can see, this really isn't the 2/3, 1/3 split that we're expecting. So that's why we test on different devices. And I did test other displays and devices, and it was displaying as I was expecting. But so anyway, what it allows you to do is it actually lets you say, hey, I'm doing this layout. I want my header to stretch this way. I want my main content. I want a sidebar. And I want a footer, because that's a pretty standard, at least blog setup in layout, is you've got your sidebar where you're going to put some widgets, your main content, and the header and the footer. So it actually allows you to take a div or an area and you assign it to live in that area by using classes. So if you look at my HTML, I have a header with a class of header, main with main content, and a side with sidebar, and footer with footer. And I'm creating that layout by assigning each to its own grid area, rather than having to write out all of the HTML. It's doing it automatically. It's just, and you can change. So if I actually go here, change that to main content, we're gonna change that to sidebar, save and run, and if I refresh, you can see it flipped them. And you're probably thinking, okay, that's cool, but is that actually useful to me? And it is, because I just switched 2 lines of code and completely changed the layout of the page, rather than having to actually go in and edit the HTML files and move things around, or mess with positioning the way we used to have to do things in years past.
About accessibility and screen readers.
That's a very good question. So when you do something like what I did, and there are very few circumstances where you'd actually want to flip something like this. When you make any changes with accessibility in screen readers, like Chris just mentioned, it doesn't actually change the how the screen reader reads it. So someone who's using a screen reader, the main content would still be read before the sidebar. So that is kind of a it's more of a gotcha than anything else, because you're only so it's not actually, it doesn't make it inaccessible, it just doesn't, the screen reader's not going to work the way your layout is, it's going to work the way your HTML is, which is it's kind of a just something to be aware of, because you're not making your code inaccessible to people, it's just going to display for them differently than it would
I
because they're using a screen reader.
the ability to have that flexibility is something like that. Can that be conditional? Can there be conditions where visitor one has their preferences, or visitor one is X, Y, or Z, so they can see this layout versus another?
So any conditional logic, you would have to do that with JavaScript, because you can't really, although in CSS we do have the ability to do things like variables now, there is still no conditional logic in strictly CSS, but that's absolutely something you can do fairly easily with rearranging the properties with jQuery or JavaScript, but that's not, if conditionals are not available in strictly CSS. What? All right, so I talked much faster than I expected. That is about all I have for my content, but I welcome any questions that anyone has, and I'll actually just to...
Rich, do you want to go over the kind of the mechanics of how those areas are defined? And
how the grid template areas...
Right, how does that match with the properties down in the header selector and the footer selector and all that?
Yeah, so where this says header, where this string is headers, that's just, it's taking the 3 fractional units and setting them to header or cross. Then this is the grid template area, and the grid template area is the parent property. The child property to that is grid area, and that's where you're setting header based on the grid template. And grid template areas, you have to enter it as a string in either single quotes or double quotes. When you set it in the area, you do not set it as a string. You just type in the keyword. Yes?
And the 3 headers, that's just arbitrary. You could have 5.
Yes, you could have 5, you could have 10. It's really whatever you want. And you actually don't even... I put the header, main content, and sidebar, and then the footer on 3 separate lines. I did that as a personal preference. You can have everything on one line, and that's not going to affect how the markup gets rendered and how it works. I just do that for readability in my own code.
Do we have to do 3 headers in your example? Or can you just do 1 header and go to single column?
Yeah, it depends on how your layout is. So you need to have, when you're doing grid template areas, the amount of keywords you're using directly correlates to the amount of columns that you have.
So can we see what it would look like live if you took out header, main contact, and footer, like one of each, and then there was just 2? Does that make sense?
So take out,
Because you have to have it even, right?
It's gonna be
yes. So now when I refresh, so it will display the same because we took them out and they still all have, like it's still stretching across because there's the same amount in each. If I delete a footer and make it so they're unequal, See, so now you can see that by just removing that single, I'm just going to take those spaces out to make sure that I didn't cause a bug. Yeah, so now that's actually breaking the layout by them being unequal. And you can also, another thing that CSS Grid allows you to do, which you can also do in Flexbox, but it does again create the issue where a screen reader is showing something that the markup is not, is you can set like your order in Flexbox or Grid, but that only changes the order on the styles and how it will appear. It doesn't actually affect the order of the markup. And the same thing with Flexbox if you use, like there's column reverse and row reverse. It works the same way. Chris, did you have a question?
Well, the other thing you can do is in media queries you can change your layouts completely on different screens sizes.
Which, thank you. I swear I did not plant him to do this, but that is actually what I did here. And you do have to remember that I did mess with the, so we did toggle where the sidebar was and where the main content was. If I go back and fix that so it makes sense. Nope. The grid areas, because even though I dropped them down, all equally, it still works. So I wrote a media query, which I can show you. So what I did was, and actually because I reset the grid template areas in the media query, they're still all three. And the reason these other properties don't actually need to be in there, because they can be inherited, I just copied and pasted and was lazy.
Well, you don't have to.
Didn't go back and delete them. But it actually allows you to set it so the sidebar now comes below the main content and then still above the footer. Yes, question?
So if you're going for that one column layout, then you can just do, you don't have to repeat it 3 times, right? In the media query.
No, you wouldn't have to. I just copied and pasted my code. But yeah, it could just be header, main content, sidebar, and footer. Yes.
Do you know if WordPress core uses Flexbox or CSS Grid or any of that, or whether it's the 20X-Team themes or Gutenberg or any of that?
So yes, I do know that Flexbox is used in, I know it's used in the 2017 theme and in the 2019 theme. I don't believe Grid are being used in either because they still wanted the Internet Explorer support. And actually, it may or may not be being used when people are writing blocks for Gutenberg, because with Gutenberg being React-based, there are polyfills to allow backwards browser compatibility written within JavaScript. So you can use Grid like CSS Grid, and the JavaScript creates a backwards compatibility for IE11. I don't believe Gutenberg Core is doing that. I'm not sure, but I am sure there are some block authors doing things like that for their own convenience.
Grid now is awful.
On the second example, when it's at full width, it was columns, right?
Yes.
When went down responsive, it switched to a single column layout.
Yes.
But there's no media query, so how did you achieve that exactly?
Right. So in the second example, that's where the min-max comes in, and the one FR. And if we
So it's like when a column goes below 200, it switches over to a single, going below 100%.
yeah, so
That kicks in.
exactly. So the functional keyword allows you to set a column to be one FR, but you can set it to shrink or expand no further than 200 pixels. So that's what the min-max is doing, is it's setting the maximum.
Okay, so it's a bit more layout specific rather than breakpoint specific.
Exactly. It's completely based on how you're laying out your grid and not how you're like the media query. So it creates that responsivity without having to.
You don't have to test it every single
Exactly. You don't have to. And
side with break.
if I, yeah. So you can see if I just grab it and go
Okay, yeah.
like that, it's doing it automatically. And it would get wider than the 4 across if it was a bigger monitor, yeah. Yep.
Can you do crazy layouts like masonry and things? with
Yes.
or
So you can, so this layout that I did here is as close to a masonry layout that you can do without, well, there are a couple of ways to do masonry layouts. If this CSS Grid course by Wes Boss is free, and he has he actually shows you how to create a Pinterest style masonry layout, but that does use JavaScript. The other way to do it, and it can get a little funky, is there is a property called dents. And what dents does with grid autoflow, if you have, which one is it? This one. So say I didn't, and actually I'll just break it so I can show you. I want that to be 11. Let's make. All right. So let's see how well I broke this. Okay. Yes, I did. Thank you. So what dents does is dents is actually when I set the property. I just want to make sure. So the container grid autoflow dents. I'm just going to copy that. So if I change this keyword to dents, save that, refresh. So you can see what it did is and if you're doing a masonry layout, something like Pinterest, you're not as concerned about in a true masonry layout. Like this does create that same difference with accessibility. But in a masonry layout versus a standard layout, it's not as big of a deal that they don't match. But you can see it fills the, like line 1 now, it goes 1, 4, 5, 6, 8, then 2, 9, 10, 11, 3, 7, and then 12. So it will fill it automatically with just CSS, which is pretty cool, but it can also create gaps. Like you can see they weren't able to put anything next to 3, so it's just, there's a gap at the end of the row.
Any other questions?
All right.
Thanks, Rich.
Thank you. And I will post links to my code pens and this page from my site in the meetup details. So we'll have that.